Welcome
to the Expert
PK
and Newbie podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Expert PK and Newbie podcast, the podcast where each week we take a passage of the Bible, we read it together and we discuss it, getting the three different perspectives off of three different people. As always, I have Lachlan Miller, our expert.
Hello.
I've got Morgan Carter, our newbie.
Hi.
And I'm Joshua Lee, the PK. How are we going, guys?
I'm going well. A few episodes ago, I think I was sharing about the fact that I've been planning a series for church and the minor prophets, which we're going to be looking at on a Sunday. But this week, I've been preparing all the material for our Friday night youth program this term. And we're actually going to look at the life of Abraham. And so I just want to pause right here and say, if any of my youth or any of my leaders are listening right now to learn about Abraham, hello, welcome to our episode.
Calling them out.
Yeah, I reckon. So that's exciting. It's nice to be able to look at those things at youth and spend my week looking at that, which also has helped me as we come today to also look at the life of Abraham. So that's how I am.
Nice.
How are you, Morgan?
I'm good. Still enjoying some time off, just catching up with friends, doing things I haven't been able to do with work, going little day trips. But yeah, I'm good. And how are you going, Josh?
Good, doing well. We've got at the time of we're recording this, Easter is coming up, so I've just been trying to prepare for all our Easter shenanigans and Easter services. Whether or not I've taken on too much work, I've taken on the of doing the sermon for Good Friday and Easter, then also our Saturday Passover meal. So just been trying to prep as much as I can for a very big weekend. But after that, it should be nice to just sort of relax for a bit. So, apart from trying to prep everything, doing well. I think I'm in a good spot though, in saying like there's a lot happening, but I'm in a good position.
I know I've already suggested this to you before, Josh, but why don't you just play our episodes from Matthew on the death of Jesus on Good Friday and our episode from Matthew on the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday?
Look, I could.
And then you don't have to prep anything.
It's the backup plan. We'll just pop that on the screen and then I'll just sit back.
Sounds like a great plan for Easter. I think it's good content.
Yeah. If you haven't heard already, if you're new to the podcast or you haven't just heard any of our announcements, we've got a Patreon. So if you want to support us financially in that way, head over to Patreon and you can find out all the details there. Morgan, what chapters are we doing today?
Today we're continuing in Genesis and we're doing chapters 12 to 14.
Today's passage comes from the book of Genesis, chapters 12 to 14. These chapters begin the story of Abram, who was chosen by God to be both blessed and become a source of blessing for the rest of humanity. In these chapters, we see Abram's migration to Canaan, his journey to Egypt when Canaan is hit by a severe famine, and the rescue of his nephew Lot when Lot is captured by an alliance of 4 kings.
So last episode, I alluded to the fact that we're now entering a new section of the book of Genesis. You see, what we've had before in the book of Genesis is like a general survey of all of humanity. There's large, big events, but theology about those events has been of the primary importance. And like Genesis itself focuses on the theology more than the events. But now, as we hit chapter 12 and the life of Abram, we really transition to a totally different style. The narrative becomes really matter of fact and is just presented to us. And we as the audience are left to try and figure out the theology sort of for ourselves. It's no longer as explicit or as clear. And so the narrative both slows down because we're now looking at the life of just one character for a long time instead of a vast amount of years. And we as the interpreters are left with more work to do. And so it really feels like a new distinct part of the book of Genesis as we hit the life of Abram.
Especially because we're going to now sit with Abram for, his entire life and then his descendants after that, and we'll just continue on with the journey there. Like we sort of started like a little bits of seeing people's lives with the descendants of Adam and Eve, and then more so with Noah and then his descendants. And now we're really sort of sticking with just Abram and Sarai.
I guess straight up, I just want to ask why the name Abram and Abraham? Why is it 2 names?
Yeah, fair. So Abram is his name, and we won't see the name Abraham pop up until next episode, many chapters away. But Abram is just his name. The name means my father is great, which is a nice name to be called, but we will see that God brings a new significance to his name later on by changing it slightly.
Abram's his original name and then it gets changed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a Simon Peter situation from our Matthew series of you have one name and then God appears to you and goes, actually, I have a more appropriate name for what you are going to do or be or represent. And so I think we're all going to struggle, but we'll try to just call him Abram in this episode and for most of next episode until he actually formally changes his name to Abraham.
Yeah, Abram and Abraham is very similar, but at least Sarai and Sarah are a bit more different, so it's easier to make the distinction between the two.
Yeah, we'll see how we go.
We see how we go.
So the characters that we see here at the very beginning of 12 were actually all introduced at the end of chapter 11. So at the end of last episode, we briefly chatted about Abram, Sarai, and Lot, wondering if we remember anything about them from last episode as we dive into looking at this story of theirs.
I remember that Sarai couldn't bear children.
Yep, very important for the story.
We're speculating that Abram wasn't the firstborn. Was potentially. We don't know for sure, but was probably not the firstborn. And then Lot is the nephew of Abram.
Yes. So one of Abraham's brothers, did it already. One of Abram's brothers died, and that is Lot's father. And the other thing that we said was that Abram's father was a pagan. And so we don't know what sort of relationship Abram had with Yahweh, the Lord of all creation. But we do know here at the very beginning of 12 that Yahweh appears before Abram and gives him a command. In fact, he actually gives him 2 commands here, and each command then comes along with several promises. And so the very first command is go.
And when I read this start of 12, to me, it was like another kind of trust in the Lord, like another putting all the faith in and all the trust. And you see in 4, it says, so Abram went. So he just put all trust in it and just went with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Perfect observation.
I always wonder whenever we get those where they get the call from God, Jesus, and they just go, it's like, was it always that easy? Did they do it? Like, should I be more like that? Like, and just get up and go. I always wonder, I'm like, was it a bit of convincing? Did they need to talk about it? Like, what was that conversation like?
Unfortunately, we're not going to get an answer for Abram because, as Morgan pointed out, chapter 4 just says, so Abram went.
He just went.
But you've got to realize what the call is going on here. So he lives in right? This is how my study Bible put it. It's effectively the New York City of the ancient world. Like, this is the pinnacle of civilization. This is where you want to be. It's got every resource or facility you can imagine for an ancient person. And he's told to go to like a backwater rural area of Canaan and told to go to this just not as nice land. Like, leave comfort, leave the New York City or leave the London or leave the Tokyo and go to a random little rural town.
And Canaan, like the land of Canaan, would have been a bit more sort of like hostile towards them, right? Because with competing tribes and clans and everything. Because Canaan came from the line of Ham?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to get it correct.
Yeah, it just seemed like Canaan was a place where lots of different tribes lived, which back in the day, tribal affiliation was everything. Like, if you weren't aligned with a tribe, you probably had conflict with them. And so here he is as a total stranger, leaving a land and an area where his tribe or his family had influence and going to a place where he didn't have any of that.
Yeah, and it's a big call, call on his life. It's a big command to sort of go take, because he's leaving the comfy, like what we're imagining, the comfy, the cushiony sort of hustle and bustle of that lifestyle, and going into the unknown, going into the uncomfortable. I'm assuming here, so great faith shown just to get up and go.
Yeah, which is that first command. And the promises that God promises in return is he will make Abraham a great nation, he will bless him, and he'll make his name great. Pretty cool things.
Yeah.
Interestingly, at least that last one is exactly what the people at the Tower of Babel last episode were trying to achieve for themselves. They were working so hard to make their name great. And here God just offers it.
It's through God that you will be great, not on your own accord. You could try, but as we can see, God might just disperse that out
across the entire face of the planet. Yep.
But it's through God's grace, through God's power, that you can become great, but only through God.
Yeah. And then the second command, the second imperative we see in the text is be a blessing. Now, I think the way the NIV translate this is actually quite unhelpful because it makes it sound like it's part of the promises being given to Abraham. But that is actually a command. So that line, and you will be a blessing in the NIV, is actually a command of be a blessing.
Which verse was that? Sorry?
End of verse 2. Because you often use a different translation, Josh. What does yours say?
NLT. And I will, from the start of 2, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others.
Okay, so the NLT's done the same as the NIV, which is kind of softened the fact that that is an imperative there. Like it's a command. It's not a promise like the 3 previous things. It is a be a blessing. And then if he is a blessing towards other, these are the 3 promises God says he will do, which is he will bless those who bless him, he will curse those who curse him, and all people will be blessed through Abraham. Those are the 3 promises after that command to be a blessing.
Be a blessing rather than you will be a blessing.
Yeah. You said the same sentence twice.
Did
but I heard the tonal shift.
Anyway, I get it.
I noticed to the age where it says he was 75 years old. Is that significant? Because all the other ages seem so high. Like, obviously, we don't know exactly how old that was then, but they were always like 150 years old or 200 years old. Or does that mean he was quite young?
The way he responds in these stories is of a middle-aged man, like in terms of how active he seems to be, but also the respect that's granted to him. So given that he lives to, 175, I think we could see his age of 75 trying to convey to us that this is a middle-aged man.
Not a young bloke.
Yes.
And we've always made that distinction of when we get to like when they are Abraham and Sarah and they have kids, of like they were having kids at such an older age that was a miracle in itself.
Yeah.
That's sort of like, when we pick apart that part.
And Sarai is an equivalent age to Abram. And in the second half of chapter 12, when he goes to Egypt, he's worried that people will kill him because she's so beautiful. And so again, I don't think we're necessarily meant to picture a woman of 70, but more of a middle-aged woman there.
Yeah.
Just to return briefly to the promises, because I think that final promise of all people on earth will be blessed through you is actually very significant, because I think this is the promise where we eventually get Jesus. Because when you look at the life of Abram, his life is not a blessing to every person on earth. Maybe he was a blessing to those in his local community. Those in his household are definitely blessed, but you could not argue that just his lifetime, he blessed all people on earth. But I think what comes from him is the promised redeemer of back in Genesis, of someone who will crush the snake's head. And we know that that's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus as one who can bless all nations on earth. And so we do see the gospel and God's plan really moving forward in Abraham.
And it says that like all the families on earth will be blessed through you. Like not all the families during your time on earth will be blessed. It's like, or on earth, so it's like that will go through the ages, further than just Abram.
But along with all of these blessings, we also return to that issue that we had, which is that Sarai is childless and can't conceive. And yet half of these promises seem to rely on the fact that he's going to have a large family and a large nation that will descend from him. And so there's already a slight conflict or contradiction in terms of where Abraham is at in his mind, because he's being promised things that he can't currently see how they're going to be fulfilled.
Which further emphasizes that trust that he has in God, whether it was like, full trust or like, I don't know, but I'll follow you, like, depending on what scale that is, doesn't matter. There's still the trust was there to go forth with this. So also probably like interesting to point out that when like families move, it's not just Abraham and Sarai moving, or Abraham, Sarai, and Lot moving. It's probably all their servants, as it says here, their livestock and all their wealth as well, sort of travel through them. And so I always get this image of like 3 people or 2 people sort of wandering through, going from town to town. And it's like, well, it would have been a big family unit, like quote unquote family unit because they didn't have kids, but like servants and possibly slaves or like.
Well, it does say the people they had acquired.
It's a very specific word.
Yep. I read one commentator who said that this was like getting of souls, almost like evangelism, that Abram went to the people in the city that he lived in and went, I've been approached by this God who told me to go here, who would like to come. And so that is an option. It doesn't have to just be slaves.
Yeah.
But alternatively, it could be the people they acquired were literally the slaves that they brought with them.
And so, for me, that just emphasizes how big of a move this is, because you're up, like, again, not just two or three people moving, it's upheaving your entire life and moving it forward.
In verse 7, where the Lord appears and says to Abram, to your offspring, I'll give this land, isn't the Lord kind of all-knowing? So he would have already known that Sarai couldn't have offspring?
Yeah, absolutely.
So why would he kind of say that? Is it kind of to say, like, I know, but I'm still going to do it anyway?
I think we are going to see the power of God in the life of Abram, because Abram's big conflict or big tension point is the fact that while he is already a somewhat great man, like he's got a large retinue of people following him, he's got wealth, he has no offspring, he has no descendant, he has no heir. And God, in verse 7, promises that he will end up with an heir, despite the fact that Sarai can't have children. And as we read further along, we will see that change, but only because of the intervention of the God of all creation.
It's like setting up that story of like, we're blessed by knowing how the story ends, but like setting, like, as you said, that conflict point of that like tension, that sort of hill that has to get like overcome, and sort of hinting at what might come later. But yeah, no, you're right, Morgan, of like, and as we said before, of, if there would have been maybe that question in Abram and Sarai's head of like, well, if you're all knowing, we can't bear children, so like, why?
Yeah, it's like rubbing salt in the wound. Like,
Literally. And this is going to be a tension point for him for the rest of the story. And he's going to honestly sin greatly in trying to achieve this and not trust God in certain moments. But ultimately, God is going to fulfill that promise of, to his offspring, I will give this land. I do want to pause here for a second and reach into the New Testament. Paul in Galatians 3:16 really interestingly says this. He says, God gave the promise to Abraham and his child. And notice that the scripture doesn't say to his children, as if it meant many descendants. Rather, it says to his child. And that, of course, means Christ. So I have a few things I want to draw from this. Firstly, Paul clearly sees Jesus here and says the promises to Abram, sorry, I'm not going to be able to stop doing this, to his child, to his offspring, singular. And Paul says that is Jesus. Every promise given to Abram, we see fulfillment only in Jesus. There is no one else from Old Testament history that we see all of these things fulfilled in. It's only eventually in Jesus is this all fulfilled. The second thing I draw from this is something as simple as whether a word is a singular or a plural, Paul thinks is ordained and inspired by God. He builds an entire theology on the person of Christ based on the fact that effectively this word offspring doesn't have an S on the end. And so at least the way Paul views scripture is that every dot, every letter is inspired and enough to bring theology from, which I think is very inspiring in terms of how we look at scripture. Well,
it's funny because it's clearly, meaning Jesus. And it's like, is it? It's like, is it that clear? I just once explained sort of, I get it. Like in terms of like lineage and going from the promise from Abram all the way to Jesus. But yeah, I don't know. I just find it funny. Like, Paul, is it that clear? I mean,
Paul thinks it's very clear the fact that these promises are for Abram's offspring, singular. And then he goes, well, Isaac didn't get all this. Jacob didn't get all these promises fulfilled. Israel nationally didn't get all these promises fulfilled yet. But there is one offspring of Abraham who did. But let's return to the Old Testament, return just to Genesis, and not spend too much time talking about Jesus, even though that's what I'd prefer to be doing always.
Is there any significance about the great tree of, is it Moreh?
Look, when it comes to a lot of the names we're going to approach in the rest of the Old Testament, just say it confidently and we'll all know what you're referring to. There is potentially significance. It's fairly well known that Canaanites often built shrines amongst groves of oak trees. That was part of the Canaanite religion. So potentially what is happening here is Abraham rocks up to like a cult center of the Canaanite religion. That is an option. Another option is just the fact that Abram is a nomadic herdsman, right? He has no city, and all the good cities in the area are claimed by the Canaanites. So all the good pieces of land are already claimed. And so the only reference points he has as a nomad traveling around this land are natural features rather than like near this city. Well, that doesn't matter to him because he can't go near it. He can't put his herds near it. he can't use that land. But a random large tree, potentially that's a natural feature that he can refer to and know exactly where that is, and a place that he could actually stay for a while. So those are the kind of two options for what could be happening with the fact that this great tree is mentioned.
Yeah, I've heard sort of it being explained of like, well, the Canaanites would worship the the oak trees or these big trees, and because Abram then set up shop near one of these trees and then made an altar there,
Built an altar to Yahweh.
Yahweh, he then changed what that significance is, like what that sort of the symbol of an oak tree is no longer to a pagan god; it's now to Yahweh. It's now to our God there, and so he's sort of changing the pagan ways, sort of thing. That's what I've heard.
I think someone like Luther, the guy who started the Reformation, would probably agree with you, because he translated, in our version it says, and here Abram called on the name of the Lord. Luther translated that as Abram preached the name of the Lord. And so suggesting that Abram rocks up to this location, he builds an altar to his God, and then he starts preaching about his God. And if this was center of Canaanite worship and religion, Abraham is presenting a new and better religion at that exact spot. Before we finish with this first half of chapter 12, something that I should have brought up when we were mentioning Galatians just a second ago is in our first 3 verses, we read through these promises given to Abram, and they're fantastic. Back in Galatians 3:29, Paul says, "Now that you belong to Christ, you are the true children of Abraham. You are his heirs, and God's promises to Abraham belong to you." And so just before we move any further on, as Christians, Paul tells us that we can cling to these promises.
Those commands have been fulfilled, so we get to reap the reward of the promises through Jesus.
Yeah. And then I guess after this really fantastic moment of faith of Abraham just going and leaving everything behind, we start to see some cracks in the character of Abram as he heads down to Egypt, and we see that, God doesn't just call perfect people.
Anyone else feel like this section was a bit gross and like felt a bit like like sort of reading it? Like that's the feeling I got of like, a famine strikes the land of Canaan. They're forced to go to Egypt, and Abraham's worried over his own life rather than the life of everyone else, or at least that's how I sort of read it. Probably a bit selfish of him, and decides to let everyone know that Sarai is not his wife, but his sister. And then that there's a whole kettle of fish of problems.
Can I start by pointing out that this is only a half lie or half truth?
Okay.
So Sarai is Abram's half sister. Factually, biologically, they have the same father. They have different mothers, but they have the same father.
Okay, so the genes are slightly different, but I don't know if that makes it better. I mean, like knowing that, I'm like, oh, the lie, like knowing the lie. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Knowing that there's a bit of truth, I'm like,
I knew you would have that reaction because you're like, oh, gross. He claims that Sarai's his sister. I'm like, well, actually,
well, no, it's actually the gross part isn't that they're sisters. You've just made it even grosser. The gross part is that to save his own life, he's instead of calling Sarai his wife, where they would be like, oh, we like Sarai, so we're going to kill Abram and take Sarai for her. And it's like, no, it's sister, so we're just going to buy Sarai off you. And like, that's the gross part I find. Like, but then you've added this other element. Where I'm like, oh, okay.
Extra gross element. There is a logic to what Abram does. It's a logic born of fear, but given the fact that he says, and the text says that Sarai is very beautiful, if he claims to be her brother, then rather than killing him to get her, they would bargain with him and potentially make him rich in order to get her. And the whole idea would be, because that bargaining process would take a while, it would give Abram time to flee or get out of there. The only flaw in the plan is that someone as powerful as Pharaoh has no need to bargain. He just takes what he wants. And so had anyone else in Egypt had their eyes on Sarai, Abram would have gotten out of this scot-free because they would have entered a bargaining process, and during that time he probably would have fled. But Pharaoh can take what he wants. And I think we're meant to see here a lack of faith from Abram. Firstly, he leaves the land God promised to him at the first sign of a famine. I think that is actually a sign of distrust, because God has promised him this land And then Abram effectively says, well, this land can't even support me. I'm out. And then we see him out of fear lying to Pharaoh. And so I think we're meant to see that Abraham has a lot of lack of faith here. And now by the end of his life, we'll see him come leaps and bounds and overcome a lot of things. But Abraham's story is like all of our stories, a lot of ups, a lot of downs.
And he may have thought that he was doing the right thing of like trying to, well, God said that that either my descendants, however that may happen, have to live on, and so in order for that to happen, I need to live on. So he may have been sort of like maybe got the wires sort of crossed in that like lack of trust and thinking, no, this is what I need to do because I'm meant to live. That's what God sort of told me. But yes, like you said, he's left Canaan. He's left what God's sort of instructed him to do already.
I think one thing that a Jewish reader reading this story would pick up even more so than us is the parallels between this story and the Exodus story. And so, for instance, you have a famine in the land, which causes the descendants to go into Egypt, but then there is an attempt to kill off a bunch of the males in order to get the females. We then see plagues upon Egypt sent by God, which kind of spoils Egypt and ultimately leads to deliverance and exit out of Egypt. Now, I think those parallels are helpful because this, before it was written down, was probably a story that the Israelites, even when they were in slavery in Egypt, would have told each other. Like, that is how we think this story has been preserved via oral history. And so they already have a story of the father of their nation escaping Egypt through the power of God, which would have brought them great comfort knowing that that was possible for them. Because as God intervenes in the Exodus story, he also intervenes here because he decides that God is always faithful to his word and faithful to his promises to Abram, even when Abram is not.
And it's fulfilling the sort of the promise of like, if someone curses you, I will curse them. It's like showing that God continues to keep his word there. It's also interesting that this is preluding when we do see the Egyptian people and Pharaoh more in the stories. As we see it here, we'll see it when we get to Joseph and his colourful coat.
Coat of many colours.
Many colours. And when we get to the Exodus story. And so, we're getting hints of Egypt and Pharaoh, but we'll see a lot more of them later.
In the start of 13, how does Abram become so wealthy?
We see that at the end of chapter 12, which is effectively that Pharaoh made Abram very wealthy in exchange for, Pharaoh thought he was getting a wife out of it. So in exchange for Sarai, he gives Abram all of this stuff. It says herds and camels and just wealth beyond belief as payment for Sarai. And then he discovers the truth about Sarai. She returns to Abram and he kicks Abram out of Egypt, but still allows him to keep all of those things. And so while I think we're meant to see the end of chapter 12 as a low light in the story of Abram's faith, he does leave exceptionally wealthy from his trip to Egypt.
And we should give Sarai a lot of credit here because she's gone through a lot of being sort of sold off, of having to experience all of that, and then coming back and continuing that life with Abram and the journey they go. And it's a huge thing, and probably to commemorate her faith in God, and just to keep sort of just going. Yeah, I think it's just quite commendable that she gets the short straw here, unfortunately, yes. But still keeps up, is still able to keep up the good work despite all this happening, which I can't imagine in any scenario how this would have been sort of awful to experience, but to still come out of it and continue the journey on.
Well, the only reason she comes out of it is because God intervenes and sends plagues upon Egypt, which feels really unfair in this particular story. The Pharaoh did nothing wrong in this particular story. He added another wife to his collection, which we would say is morally dubious, but for their culture, it didn't do anything wrong. In his eyes, she wasn't married. And then suddenly he gets all these plagues from God. And so Sarah is rescued out of this situation by Yahweh when none of the human actors are doing anything the right way. But yeah, since Morgan took us to chapter 13, maybe let's continue into that. after the low light of the end of 12, I think we see another highlight here, another good moment from Abram, which is him and his nephew Lot are so wealthy that they realize they need to separate. And Abram is the patriarch of the family. He's the one that God promised this entire land to. He has the right to claim whatever piece of land he wants to, but in a moment of generosity, in a moment of faith in God's promises, he lets his nephew Lot actually decide what piece of land he would like first.
And it's showing sort of that, like, Abraham now going sort of that upwards sort of journey now from the low of the generosity of he gets to show to Lot, but also the faith and trust in God of like, well, whichever land I get, I'm now going to trust that the Lord will provide in that land, rather than trying to sort of go, oh, that one's going to be great for me, I'm going to go with that one. Lot, you get the other one. You know, I think there's generosity and faith in both aspects.
In verse 14 of this chapter, they talk again about offspring and what they'll give to the offspring. It's really interesting they brought it up again. It's like, is it reminding him to like trust again, and like, is it a bit of a reminder to Abram?
I think it's a really cool moment of Abram has just expressed generosity to his nephew of letting him choose any piece of land. Generosity is a sign of faith in God's promises, because faith does not selfishly seek one's own desires, but instead is self-denying. And so Abraham has done this great, generous action, and then God appears to him and reaffirms the previous promises, reaffirms the covenant, but also almost emphasizes a bit more. It's almost a bit richer, because instead of his descendants just being a great nation, like in chapter 12, now we're told that they're going to be as numerous as the dust of the earth. And so he takes the promises that he's already guaranteed to Abram and heightens them even further. And it seems, in the way that the story is told, that this is because Abram has done this act of generosity and this act of faith.
And it says here, like, Abram settled in the land of Canaan. So he's gone back to that original command, back to it. So like, almost like back to square one. But there's probably a bit more of like a journey that's happened and a bit of learning that they've gone through. But yeah, like back to square one. And as we just said before, the generosity, he could have not picked that part of the land, but he sort of kind of does, and the faith that it provided, despite it also saying that people were continuing to, like, the people around in these cities in the land of Canaan were continuing to sin against the Lord, but Abram was staying strong.
Yeah, and I think we're meant to see that line there as a really ominous line of Lot looked around and he made his choice on a purely human level of he really loved the grazing areas near Sodom. And so on a human level, great decision, go take the best bit of the land. But the text gives us this ominous warning that the people of Sodom sinned greatly. And that is going to be continued later in chapter 19.
And at the end of chapter 13, we see more great trees. They love their trees.
They do.
Anything significant about these ones?
I think everything we said about the previous tree could probably apply here, but I do like the idea that Abram is wandering throughout the land of Canaan, and just everywhere he stops, he constructs an altar to the Lord. It's almost like he's leaving little monuments to Yahweh across this promised land.
Yeah, it's probably like that significance of, well, they're landmarks, these big trees, so I know where we are, but I'm building an altar to sort of tear down the false idols that have been created surrounding these trees. And
then we move to chapter 14 and see immediately that Lot's decision was a bad one.
Especially since this, like, the heading that the Bible, that people like to write before the chapters is Abraham rescues Lot. This is a story that I sort of completely forgot or didn't realize was in. I didn't realize that, well, warring breaking out between different clans, tribes, people, but then also Abraham getting involved in it as well. But this is sort of like showing how there's still human greed in the world. There's still like war. There's still sort of like this sin. Humans are just against each other, despite the massive restart that we've seen before, sort of happening again.
Morgan, after we finished reading chapter 14, before we started recording, you said that it was exceptionally confusing. Have you put together who is where and what's going on in the short time since we started recording?
No. So up until about probably 11, verse 11, confused. I feel like I need to like draw it out and map it out.
Yeah.
Fair.
There's just a lot of names and context.
I was only able to understand this passage when I did exactly that. My first and second and third and fourth reading of the first half of chapter 14, I was like, wait, what is going on?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I wish I sort of have like pictures of, okay, so this person fought this person and then this person and they lost and then this, you know, and they're moving around all these like images of whoever's fighting each other.
So you have the alliance of 4 kings from the east. So this is from the area of Babylon. We see one of the kings is explicitly the king of Shinar. So we said in our last episode that the plains of Shinar is where Babylon is. And so we've got the 4 kings from the east, and that's an alliance. That's a group of people. Then we have the alliance of 5 kings, which is from the Jordan Valley. Now, when you stop and think, while it seems like it's an alliance of 4 kings versus alliance of 5 kings, like 5 cities in one little valley is sort of nothing compared to the 4 kings that represent these eastern powers. And so these 4 kings are waging war against a whole bunch of people, conquering, building their empire, and they arrive at the Jordan Valley, and these 5 kings of the Jordan Valley try to rebel, try to fight, and get absolutely destroyed. And so the 4 kings destroy the 5 kings and seize everything that they have, which included Lot, who was living in the area.
Poor Lot.
I just feel bad for Lot because everyone got these really cool names and he got Lot.
That's true. Lot. A lot could be cool. I don't know.
To our ears, maybe not, but maybe it was a great name back in the day.
If you're listening and your name's Lot, we love it.
Please write in, send us a comment.
Yeah, no, I'd love to know if someone's actually named Lot. That would be fun. It's interesting because whenever we think of like kings or like people of like royalty, quote unquote, for the very least, my mind always goes to like what at least I'm used to, which is like the UK, the British like style of king, where it's one sovereignty that rules over a land.
You're thinking a kingdom.
I'm thinking
You're not
the
thinking
kingdom.
city-states.
Yes, which there could be multiple, you know, quote unquote kings within like a single sort of land.
Yeah. Every city had a king because they were just city-states. They weren't united by anything.
Yeah. And so I guess that's probably like a sort of a cultural maybe disconnect of like, well, these aren't kingdoms going to war with each other. These are, as you said, city-states.
And so after Lot is captured, they come to Abram the Hebrew.
Yes.
The first time we see the word Hebrew in the Bible. We did say last episode that one of Abram's ancestors is where we get the word Hebrew from, but this is actually the first time that it appears.
Do we know why this might be the first time it's mentioned?
No, honestly, no idea why now it suddenly popped up, but this will be a distinguishing mark or word to use to represent all of Abram's descendants from this point onwards.
And so do we think it was maybe the title Abram the Hebrew was like retroactively added because to prelude what is to come of where we get the name of one of his descendants, if that makes sense? Like,
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I suspect that instead you've got this new person who's rocked up to this land, and everyone in this land can identify themselves by what tribe they belong to. I'm Frank from the Hittite tribe, or obviously they wouldn't be called Frank, but like they all are known by their tribal background. And you have this brand new man rock up with he's about to pull out 318 fighting men, right? Like he's a sizable force to be reckoned with. And I think they probably asked, like, what tribe are you from? And I think that for whatever reason, Abram reaches back into his family tree and goes, we are the Hebrew tribe. And I just think that is how they became known, is people would have wanted to know their background. What tribe are you associated with? And that is the ancestor that Abram refers to.
Yeah. It's a nice little sort of like turning point for us as sort of reading the stories. Like we're sort of seeing like what Abram's going to become. Like we get that sort of like little like first sort of glimpse and hint of like, ooh, Abram the Hebrew, you know, and as like later becoming Abraham the Hebrew. But yeah, it's like we're slowly sort of seeing this transformation happen. He does just pull 318 trained soldiers.
Yeah, literally pulls him out of nowhere. But I think this is meant to show to us that, Abram is wealthy. Like, he may not have built a city, but he commands an insane number of people.
And it's like saying here they were born into his household. So not necessarily his offspring,
No.
not yet, but these were people that were following him, around him, servants or whatever. They were there living with him in this land, and they were born into sort of quote unquote his family.
But my question is, how did 300 men defeat this alliance of 4 kings that had just kicked the butt of the alliance of 5 kings?
That is a good observation.
Any thoughts?
I'm still just confused who's who.
4 kings from Babylon versus 5 kings from Canaan. The 5 kings lose. Abram pursues the 4 kings from Babylon because he wants his nephew back. Does that help?
Yeah. He must really love his nephew to go up against that.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, it says attacked at night. So this was an advantage.
A nighttime attack is always helpful.
I'd also probably give the textbook answer of, well, with the power of God.
Well, that's what Melchizedek does later in the chapter. He attributes Abraham's victory to Yahweh. He says, you won because the Lord is with you.
And all things are possible.
Melchizedek sounds familiar. Did we talk about him in Matthew?
Ooh, I don't think he appeared in Matthew. I could be totally wrong.
I feel like we've mentioned him before.
He's just a good dude and someone that we should start talking about at some point.
And it's a strong name, Melchizedek.
Yeah, Josh's firstborn son is going to be called Melchizedek.
Melchizedek.
Is the bread and wine here, is that where we get communion from?
No. Communion is a very New Testament Jesus concept. This is just a celebration of Abram's victory. But let's start with, who is Melchizedek? What hints do we see from the text about who he is?
He is the priest of God Most High.
Yeah. In a time when we only know about one follower of Yahweh, we only know about Abram, the follower of Yahweh, he rocks up a priest of Yahweh. Like, what?
Yeah, and we're not even like calling Abram a priest.
No.
No, this is now clearly saying that there was potentially more people following, worshipping, praising Yahweh, praising God.
Now, he's more than just a priest, though.
Is he meant to represent bringing some peace because there's just been this big fight and then he just comes out with food and wine?
Yeah, in a sense. So he is the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem. So he's the king of Jerusalem before the Israelites took it. And Salem means peace.
I did not know that. What a coincidence.
In a literal translation, the king of peace.
I didn't know that.
And his name, Melchizedek, means king of righteousness. So anyone who knows Hebrew well reads this line and goes, the king of righteousness, who was a priest of God Most High and the king of peace, came before Abram. And you're like, wait, what? There's a lot going on here with this guy who just appears out of absolutely nowhere as a priest, as a servant of God.
He wasn't one of the kings that they fought.
No.
Or was in any of the wars.
No. Not at all. He's not been a part of any of these alliances.
Yeah. That sort of confused me because I was like, I have to go back. Hang on. Did his name come up before in that big list of conflicts? So just a neutral party somewhere and just randomly rocks up.
And it's argued that Abraham recognizes him as his superior because he gives him a tenth of everything that he has. Like, you don't tithe to someone that you recognize as lower than you. You only tithe to someone that you recognize has authority over you. And here Abraham meets this person for the first time, again, who comes out of nowhere, who is both a king of Jerusalem and a priest of God, and Abraham gives him a tenth of all he had. What's interesting about Melchizedek is how significant he becomes in the New Testament. So King David, who becomes the king seated in Jerusalem on the old throne of Melchizedek, he writes a psalm where he latches onto this idea that there is a priestly king from ancient times and says, just like how there is a priestly king from the old times, a priestly king is also going to come. And we see that reappear in the book of Hebrews, where we find out that Jesus is a priest in the line of Melchizedek. And because Abram pays a tithe to this priest, it means that this priest and this line of priests is superior to Abraham. And that is what the book of Hebrew argues, is that because Jesus is part of this order of priests, this order of kingly priests, he is superior to Abram.
So saying that it's the order rather than a descendant, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so David envisions Melchizedek as the first and the initiator of an order of kingly priests, which Hebrews then says finds its fulfillment in Jesus. And so while Jesus is a biological descendant of Abram and of David, he is part of that order that was before both of them and that exists superior to them.
Yeah. So saying a priestly king is probably also like quite significant, because you could think that those two things, a priest and a king, could be at odds against each other, especially when like our sort of thoughts of what a king is, what a queen is, or someone that holds that sort of sovereignty is like sort of held in sort of the highest regard and almost sort of put on this pedestal, on almost a level of God. And you could potentially have people that might worship a king as well, but sort of saying that a priestly king, sort of you're melding what could be these two opposites together, and is almost in a way saying, like, for me, like sort of humbling that a king is putting a higher power than just themselves, if that makes sense.
I know what you're saying, but I think it's a very modern view. Like, it's a very church and state separated view of kings and priests. Because I think for this ancient audience, there's nothing odd about that, because the way that kings claimed their authority in most ancient cultures was by appealing to certain gods. So, for instance, take the pharaoh, the Egyptian concept of each pharaoh was effectively the incarnation of one of their gods. So therefore, that's where they got their authority from. And they were also the mouthpiece or the mediator between the people and the gods. And so I think the idea of combining the two is pretty normal. But given the history of Israel, they do separate them. And so later on in history, someone like David, who is a great king, can never be a priest as well, because God really clearly delineates between the two, which is, I think, eventually where our Western concept has come from of keeping them separate.
Yeah.
But I think pre-David, pre-Israel, in the time period of Genesis 14, it's actually probably not that uncommon for the two to be aligned. I like seeing in this story Abram's character growth. And what I mean by that is one of the ways we see Abram get all of his wealth is almost taking it unfairly from Pharaoh in chapter 12. But here, where he has captured all of this property that originally belonged to the king of Sodom, he finally again displays his faith in Yahweh as his only provider and says, I will not keep any of it. Even though I potentially have a right to keep all of it, I'm not going to be wealthy off the back of your things, king of Sodom. And I like that. I also like that we see a direct contrast between the king of Sodom, who's a man named Bera, and the king of Salem, Melchizedek. And I think we're meant to see these two in contrast, because Melchizedek is someone who blesses Abraham. And as we read in chapter 12, those who bless Abram, God will bless. At the same time, we see the king of Sodom not quite curse Abram, but have a very negative interaction with him, and those who curse Abram will be cursed. And we know the eventual outcome of what happens to Sodom later in chapter 19 is total destruction. And so we see the promise of God in action. Those that bless Abraham are blessed. Those that curse him are cursed.
I guess it's sort of like saying to like what I was sort of saying before with kings is like Abram's putting his higher power in God rather than putting that power in a king that's going to provide him with something. He's making that distinction there between the two.
I really want to find, we've definitely 100,000% spoken about Melchizedek before. I remember it.
Potentially.
I swear we spoke about it in Matthew.
Because like Melchizedek appears in the book of Hebrews. I just can't think where in Matthew he would appear.
Well, unless we were just chatting about
We could have just chatted about him as an off-topic tangent. Like, absolutely, we might have done that. But I cannot for the life of me think where in Matthew Melchizedek appears.
But I honestly fully guessed that pacing. Like, that was wild.
That was great.
That was good.
My takeaway from this reading is probably about having full trust in the Lord. And like I said at the start, how he just throws it all in and just goes, just trusts. So I think, like Josh was saying before, it's a reminder for things every day and how we trust the Lord and to go with what we're kind of directed to do. So I think it was just a reminder for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when it's really hard.
Yeah.
Abraham left everything that he knew, left his whole life, and goes after God's promises and command to go.
Yeah.
And that's so admirable. And as Josh was sharing, that's a really hard thing to reflect on as well, of like, how do we do that? When do we do that? And so that's a really good reflection, but also challenge for our listeners too, Morgan.
Yeah, it's like, what is God, asking you to get up and go for? What command is he giving you? And I guess my sort of reflection and takeaway point is very similar, but to sort of add on to sort of the complete sort of trust in God is that even when we do sort of make the wrong decision, we do stumble and fall, God's going to still be there. He's not he's not going to forsake us, and he can still make something out of a bad decision if he has to. If we're still trusting in him, even in our bad decisions, he's going to trust in us.
For me, I've been saving this quote to the end of the episode because I really like it. So this is by Gordon Wenham, and he says, "The promises to Abraham renew the vision for humanity set out in Genesis 1 and 2. And so what we see in this story at the very beginning of the story of Abram is a new vision of what could be. God speaks again like he did in creation, and he starts very, very clearly this plan of salvation that will bless the entire world. And it's nice to see that story begin, and I'm excited to see more and more of it going on.
Well, as we wrap up, don't forget we've got social medias. Go follow us on social medias, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. Go check us out there. We keep those up to date, and you'll get to see sort of what the podcast is up to, and you get to see what the next chapters are, so you can sort of read ahead. As we said at the start of the episode, we've got a Patreon, so if you want to support us there, go over to Patreon. You'll get sort of early episodes, extended episodes, and some sort of extra stuff there. So if you want to support us, head over to Patreon and you'll find all the information there. And send in your questions, send in your comments, send in what you got out of these chapters, what your thoughts of Abram and Sarai and their journey that they've gone through. We'd love to know what you got out of this, what your thoughts are here, and send that in. Don't forget to share this around, share the podcast, share it to someone that you may think that might benefit to the podcast, or just share it to someone who hasn't heard of it. We'd love for this to continue to share, and we'd love the word of God to continue to share around the world. Morgan, can I just get you to end in prayer?
God, thank you that we're able to study your word, ask questions, and share this with our listeners. I pray over everyone who's listening that they'll learn something and explore your word more. Give us the ability to have trust in you and make those choices every day, and to follow what you direct us to do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. Thank you, guys, for joining us, and we'll see everyone next week. Bye.
Bye.
A Mustard Seed Creative production.